The white stallion had already killed 3 men. Now it stood thrashing in a crude wooden pen, blood in its eyes and foam on its mouth, kicking and shrieking like something hell-born. A circle of dust rose from the corral as the crowd backed away. Cowhands, townsfolk, even seasoned wranglers with cracked boots and faded hats. No one stepped forward. And then, out of the sun-hardened silence, a voice rang soft and sure. "I'll do it." The townsfolk turned. A man stood at the edge of the crowd, lean, long-legged, with dust on his shoulders and no horse of his own. Just a roll of gear strapped tight to his back, and a look that didn't blink. His shirt was pale with sweat, his face weathered by sun and quiet miles. Not a word had been spoken to him all day, but now every eye was on him. The stallion screamed again, slamming itself against the gate. A chunk of wood splintered and flew. The sheriff cursed low under his breath, and still, the drifter stared straight at the horse. But let's go back to where it all started. 2 weeks before, the town of Bleak Hollow had been a place of quiet dread. The old rancher, Elias Braddock, had died in the spring, thrown by that same white devil of a stallion in a storm when the hills still bled cold. Braddock left behind a daughter, Letty, and debts. The kind of debts that drew hungry men like buzzards, circling for land, horses, or something else. Letty wasn't the type to cry in public. Folks remembered that. Slim, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, she walked with her shoulders squared even when they lowered her father into the earth. She didn't wear black, only her usual blue dress, now dulled with trail dust and days too long in the sun. What she did wear was a gun, small, delicate, pearl-handled, her father's last gift. Braddock Ranch had once been the pride of the northern plains, home to wild mustangs, strong stock, and the best grazing this side of the divide. But now the fences were failing, the barn roof sagged, and that white stallion had turned half wild after Elias's death. Untouchable, unpredictable. They called it Ghost, though nobody knew who started it. Ghost had thrown Elias, then broken 2 hired hands' ribs, then crushed the skull of a young wrangler foolish enough to challenge it alone. When the creditors came calling, Letty made them a deal. If someone could tame Ghost before the next moon, she'd sell the ranch to the winner for $1, and her hand in marriage. The men in town laughed at first. Then they looked at her, really looked at her, at the way she held her chin, the way she kept her boots scuffed and her eyes hard. She was Braddock blood through and through, and more than one man decided he'd rather die than see her ranch taken by someone else. By the time the drifter walked into town, 3 had already failed. He came on foot. No horse, no wagon, just a coil of rope over one shoulder, and a look in his eyes like he hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks. He bought coffee and beans at the general store, nodded at the old man on the porch, then took a seat under the willow tree behind the saloon. For 4 days, he didn't say a word. Just watched. The horse, the corral, the men, the girl. Letty noticed him. Of course she did. She noticed everyone who watched Ghost. Most of them came in with swagger, then slunk off with broken bones or pride. But this one watched like he was waiting for the horse to tell him something. On the 5th day, he stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said again. The sheriff frowned. "You ain't local. You know the deal." The drifter nodded once. "You know the horse is killed." "I heard." A murmur spread through the crowd like wind over wheat. Some laughed. A few bet he wouldn't last 10 minutes. Letty, standing on the porch of the ranch house in a worn blouse and leather gloves, said nothing. Just studied him with that unblinking gaze, as if trying to read something buried deep. "What's your name, stranger?" someone asked. The drifter looked up. A moment passed. "Call me Clay," he said. They handed him a rope and opened the gate. For a long second, nothing moved. The stallion paced the far edge of the corral, nostrils wide, coat streaked with dust and dried sweat. Its eyes flashed. Then Clay stepped inside. He didn't raise his voice, Didn't wave the rope, just moved slow, measured, like he was stepping into holy ground. The crowd hushed. Even the horse seemed confused. The stallion snorted, ears pinned. Clay stopped 10 paces in. He crouched slightly, opened his palm, and waited. The horse screamed and charged. He didn't flinch. Dust rose. Hooves pounded. At the last second, the stallion veered and spun in a wide arc, flanks shuddering, kicking dust like a storm. But it didn't strike. Not yet. Clay lowered his hand, waited again. It happened like that for an hour. A strange, silent dance of man and beast. No ropes thrown, no voices raised. Just slow movements, soft sounds, and the kind of patience that doesn't come from books or pride, only from pain. By dusk, the crowd had thinned, the bets had stopped, and the sheriff leaned on the rail shaking his head. Clay was still inside the pen. So was the horse. Neither had drawn blood. Not yet. And Letty, watching from the porch, narrowed her eyes and said something under her breath that no one heard. But her hand slowly tightened around the handle of her father's old revolver. The next morning, folks woke to a silence that felt different. Not the quiet of Sunday prayer or an empty street, but the kind that comes before something changes. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By sunrise, the whole town was gathered again by the corral. Children sat on shoulders. Old men leaned on canes. And in the middle of it all stood the white stallion, ghost, head lowered, flanks rising and falling with slow, even breath. Its coat was slick with dew and dust. One of its hooves was cocked gently, resting, not pacing, not charging. Inside the pen, Clay sat cross-legged in the dirt. His hat was pulled low over his brow, his shirt damp with sweat, his face unreadable. One hand rested near the ground. Between his fingers lay a strip of rawhide he hadn't used yet. "Is he sleeping?" someone whispered. "Nah," came the reply. "He's waiting." Letty stood at the back, arms crossed. Her jaw was clenched tight. She hadn't slept either. By mid-morning, the stallion stepped forward. It wasn't a charge this time. No snort, no scream, just a cautious step. Then another. It moved like it was sniffing something invisible, something it hadn't smelled in a long time. Trust. Then, without a sound, Ghost touched its nose to Clay's outstretched hand. The crowd erupted. It was done. Or at least it looked like it. Some shouted. Some clapped backs and cursed in disbelief. And some, the ones who'd tried and failed, turned away bitter, pride hollowed out by something they couldn't name. The sheriff pushed through the crowd, face drawn. "Son of a! I'll be damned!" Clay stood slowly. He didn't grin, didn't tip his hat. He just whispered something in the horse's ear, then walked it slowly toward the gate. That night the town lit its first lanterns in days. Music floated out from the saloon. Bottles clinked. For the first time since Elias Braddock's funeral, Bleak Hollow felt alive. And inside the ranch house, a different kind of storm was brewing. Letty stared at Clay across the supper table. He hadn't asked for a thing. Not food, not money, not even her hand. He just broke a piece of cornbread in half and nodded his thanks. "You didn't do it for the land," she said finally. "No," Clay replied. "Then for me?" He looked up, held her gaze for the first time. "No," he said again. "Not yet." Silence stretched. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. "I hope not." And then she surprised herself. She smiled, just a little, but not everyone was smiling. The next morning, trouble came on horseback. 3 riders, dust-streaked and stone-eyed, crossed the ridge with the kind of ease that meant they'd been here before. Their coats were black, their rifles clean, and their badges unofficial. They were men hired by the Bailey Company, Eastern money with Western appetites. Elias had borrowed from them before his death, and now they wanted what they were owed: the land, the horse, and the girl if it came to that. The man in front, Silas Kincaid, wasn't one to smile unless something bled. He dismounted slow, like he owned the dirt. "I hear you tamed the stallion," he said to Clay, who stood leaning against the post fence, chewing a piece of hay. "Mighty impressive." Clay didn't respond. Silas spit. "Man breaks a horse like that, he deserves a prize. But here's the thing. This land don't belong to Miss Braddock no more. Not legally. We got the papers, signed and stamped in Cheyenne. We're here to collect." Letty stepped out from the porch. Her hand was on her gun. "This is still my home," she said. Silas tipped his hat. "Only till sundown." That's when the sheriff arrived. He looked tired. Looked like he already knew which way the wind was blowing. "Miss Braddock, I ain't got a choice," he muttered. "They got the writ." "No, they don't," Clay said. The sheriff turned. "Beg your pardon." Clay stepped forward, calm as ever. "Elias Braddock signed that land to his daughter before he died. It's in the county records. Not the courthouse in Cheyenne, the one in Dust Mill." Silas's eyes narrowed. Clay continued. "I passed through there on my way west. Saw the file myself." A long, cold pause. Then Silas grinned. "Well, sounds like we'll have to ride over and check, won't we?" "Yeah," Clay said. "You do that." But no one moved. Silas looked around. "Course. Might be this fella's lying." Clay didn't blink. "Try me." It wasn't loud. Wasn't a challenge. Just a plain truth hung on a thin string of steel. Silas took a breath, then turned. "Boys, mount up." They rode out, but the message was clear. They'd be back. That night the air changed again. No music from the saloon, no laughter, just the sound of boards being nailed, lanterns being dimmed, and doors locked tight. The town had seen this before. A fire doesn't always start with smoke. Sometimes it starts with silence. Letty stood on the porch and watched Clay rub the stallion down with a piece of old burlap. "You risked your neck," she said. He didn't look up. "Wasn't for you." "You keep saying that," she said. "But you stayed." He didn't answer. She stepped down from the porch, boots soft in the dirt. "Why?" Clay finished wiping the horse's flank, then straightened slowly. He looked out toward the hills, where the last of the sun was dipping low behind burnt orange ridges. "Because there's things worse than pain," he said. "Like what?" "Leaving something broken when you could have fixed it." Then he walked toward the barn, leaving her alone with the horse and the wind. From the far ridge, a flicker of light, small, distant, blinked twice, then disappeared. A signal. They weren't waiting for morning. They were coming tonight. The first war drum wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A deep, slow thud in the bones, like the earth itself was remembering something violent. It came again, softer this time, as if it had crossed miles of open plain before reaching Bleak Hollow. Clay stood alone near the barn, one hand resting lightly, on Ghost's bridle, the other on the rail. The stallion stirred, ears twitching toward the hills. Somewhere out there, in the dark folds of the land, something was moving. Back in town, the sheriff paced behind locked doors, a rifle cradled like a child in his arms. He hadn't seen a war party in 15 years, not since the treaty, but he'd heard stories. And this time, there were no cavalry bugles riding in from the east, only 3 hired men who'd vanished into the hills, and a town full of folk starting to realize how few bullets they had left. Letty stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching Clay work in the shadows. He was prepping the horse again, quiet and unhurried. No panic, no fire in his movements. He might as well have been tightening a saddle before a morning ride. "You're not surprised?" she said. "No," he murmured. "How do you know it's them?" He met her eyes. "That stallion ain't afraid of much, but he's listening." The horse's breathing had changed, shorter, tighter. Clay gave him a final pat and stepped back. "Why would they come now?" she asked. "This has nothing to do with them." "They don't think so." Letty looked toward the hills. Her voice turned low. "Because of Ghost?" "Maybe." He glanced at the horse. "Maybe because of me." She turned sharply. "You?" He didn't answer right away. "I wore blue once," he said finally. "In another life. During the drives out past Red Clay Ridge. I was just a scout, but I saw things. Worse, I walked past things." Letty's voice was barely a whisper. "Comanche?" He nodded. "They burned a village after I passed through. Said they were hunting for raiders. Truth was, they didn't care who they found." He turned to face her fully. "I kept walking, never raised a hand, never told 'em no, but I knew. That's all it takes, Letty." She didn't say anything. The barn creaked in the stillness. Clay moved to the open barn doors and looked out across the plain. The night had a different weight to it now, heavier, too quiet. No coyote calls, no cricket song. Even the wind had gone soft, like it was hiding. And then, off in the distance, a shape appeared. A single rider. Not fast, not reckless, just slow and straight. Proud. A shadow against the edge of the moonlight. Clay stepped outside. The rider stopped halfway between the town and the hills. Behind him, nothing moved. But Clay could feel it. There were others. Watching. Waiting. He walked toward the man alone. As he got closer, he could see the paint on the rider's horse, ochre swirls and black handprints. The rider wore a bone choker around his throat, and his face was lined, solemn, older than Clay, older than this town. The man raised his hand in greeting. Clay did the same. "You remember me?" the man asked. Clay's heart sank. The voice was familiar, so was the scar down the left cheek. "Your name's Red Elk," Clay said. The man nodded once. "You came through our land once. You did not stop. I know. You rode past our dead, women, children. I know." The silence stretched long and bitter. Behind Red Elk, a second figure appeared from the dark, smaller, young, barely a man. "My grandson," Red Elk said. "He was not yet born when your boots touched our soil, but he has carried the weight." Clay looked at the boy, fierce eyes, trembling hands, a war lance clutched too tightly. Red Elk continued. "Now we hear of a white man who walks with the ghost horse, one who takes what does not belong." "That horse belonged to Elias Braddock," Clay said calmly. "He died. The girl, his daughter, she made a choice." Red Elk's eyes narrowed. "The stallion was not Braddock's to tame. It was taken during the raids, stolen from the Red Fork herd. My people marked him before he had a name. We carved the sign under his mane." Clay blinked. He hadn't checked. Red Elk leaned forward. "You ride a stolen spirit, a sacred one, and now you tie it to white law, to land deals and bride wagers." A long silence. "I didn't know," Clay said softly. "Knowing doesn't change the crime." "No," Clay said, "but what I do next might." Red Elk studied him. Then slowly he dismounted. "Then do it with honor," he said. "You have until dawn." Clay watched as the rider turned and faded into the night like smoke. He walked back to the barn with a weight on his shoulders he hadn't felt in years. Inside, Letty waited, her face unreadable. "Was it them?" she asked. "Yes." "What do they want?" "Ghost." She swallowed. "Then give him." "It's not that simple." Her voice rose slightly. "Yes, it is. Give them the horse. Let them go." He stepped closer. "You made a promise, Letty." "To marry the man who tamed the horse," she said, "not the man who keeps it." They stood in silence, close enough to hear each other breathe. "They'll burn the town," she said. "We both know it." He nodded. "But not yet. They gave me until dawn." "So, what do we do?" Clay looked over his shoulder, out at the ridge where firelight flickered faintly again. He whispered, "We make it right." And in the deep dark before the storm, the quiet was filled not with fear, but with the slow sound of saddles being lifted, tack being readied, and a man preparing to return something he never truly owned, but not alone. Dawn came slow over the plains, bleeding pale gold across the grasslands, like the earth itself was exhaling. The kind of light that made even the sharpest edges of the world seem soft for a moment, before truth sharpened them again. Clay stood beside Ghost in the open pasture behind the ranch house, the horizon a thin blue line behind him. He had brushed the stallion down one final time, whispering to it in a low voice that sounded more like prayer than command. The animal stood still, silent. Not tamed, but listening. Letty stepped out of the barn, her coat drawn tight, a saddlebag slung across her shoulder. "I packed bread, salted pork, a flask of water." Clay didn't turn. "You're not coming?" "Yes, I am." He exhaled. "You don't need to see this." "I have to." Clay mounted Ghost slow, without ropes or reins. Just a thick leather strap tied loosely under the jaw. The horse didn't flinch. It let him climb like it had known this moment was always coming. Letty mounted her mare a moment later. She didn't ask permission. She just followed. As they rode, the town stirred behind them. Some watched from behind curtains. Some stepped out onto porches, hats in hand. The sheriff stood at the edge of Main Street, watching them disappear into the rising sun. By the time they reached the low ridge, the Comanche were already waiting. There were no spears raised, no drums, just 30 riders sitting their ponies in complete silence, like ghosts watching a funeral. And at the center, Red Elk waited with his grandson. Clay dismounted. So did Letty. He didn't speak, just took a step forward, walking Ghost by the strap until he stood before Red Elk. Then he gently turned the stallion, lifting its mane to reveal a faded mark, carved deep, healed over, nearly hidden in the pale of its neck. A symbol, worn by time, but unmistakable. Red Elk said nothing. Clay let go of the strap. Ghost stood between them for a heartbeat, then walked forward, on his own. The young Comanche boy reached out, hesitant at first, but Ghost didn't shy away. The stallion leaned in, touching his muzzle to the boy's chest. The boy's mouth trembled, his hands steadied. "He remembers," the boy whispered. Red Elk turned to Clay. "You could have fled, fought, lied." "I've done all three before," Clay said. "Didn't feel like doing it again." The old man nodded once. "Then maybe the spirits haven't turned their faces completely." Letty stepped beside Clay now. Her voice was quiet. "Will they leave us be?" Red Elk looked at her
and his gaze softened. "No one will burn your house or your town, but this land will always carry memory, even under grass." Letty nodded slowly. "We'll remember too." Red Elk said something in Comanche to his riders. They turned their horses without a word and began to move, silent as wind. Ghost went with them. Not led, not dragged. He walked alongside the boy, light and free, like something that had finally come home. And Clay, he didn't watch long, just turned back toward the ridge and started walking. Letty stared at him, stunned. "That's it?" He didn't stop. "There's no horse left to tame, no promise to keep." She caught up, footsteps crunching the dry grass beside his. "I didn't mean the marriage," she said. "I meant you." Clay didn't look at her. "I ain't good for staying." She reached for his arm, stopping him. "You're good for healing." He looked at her now, really looked. Her eyes were tired but clear, her fingers rough with work, but gentle in the way they held his sleeve. "I made the promise," she said, "but I didn't know what kind of man would answer it." Clay said nothing. She stepped closer. "Now I do." A long pause passed between them, and in that space was the sound of the plains, wide, open, full of everything they had left unsaid. Then Clay looked toward the horizon. His voice came low. "Nothing about me's clean, Letty. I've walked too far through blood and fire to be someone's hope." "You're not hope," she said. "You're the one who stayed when running was easier." He met her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, Clay didn't speak. He just reached up, took off his hat, and held it to his chest. A small gesture. Quiet. Honest. Letty smiled, just barely. They walked back to town together. Not fast, not certain, but side by side. And somewhere beyond the rise, in the land where the grass moved like breath and the sky never ended, the ghost horse ran free again. No longer claimed, no longer cursed, just remembered. And that was enough. Years later, folks still talked about the day the ghost horse disappeared over the ridge. Some said it was stolen back by the spirits. Others claimed the stallion became a legend among the Comanche, a creature who could outrun bullets and vanish into the trees like smoke. A few even said they'd seen it in the high meadows above Red Fork, white as bone, wild as stormlight, carrying a boy with fire in his eyes. But Bleak Hollow didn't change much, not at first. The saloon still poured whiskey. The general store still sold nails and flour. Kids still threw rocks at fence posts and dared each other to touch the old gallows tree by the creek. What changed was quieter. Letty Braddock took back her land, every inch of it, not through courts or gunfire, but by rebuilding. She patched fences herself, traded cattle with the Lakota, paid the town's debts before her own, and when the Bailey men came back months later, they found a line of neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder in front of her house, farmers, ranchers, even the sheriff. They didn't come back again. And Clay? He stayed. Not forever. Not like the roots of a cottonwood or the bones beneath the prairie, but long enough to matter. Long enough to become someone in that town, not just a stranger with quiet eyes and calloused hands, but a man with a seat at the table, a place at the barn, and a warm cup on the porch. Long enough for Letty to stop wondering if he would leave, and start hoping he wouldn't. There was no wedding right away, no vows under painted skies, just two people who rose before dawn, worked until dusk, and sat together most nights in a silence that spoke more than words ever could. One spring, a pair of Comanche riders came to the edge of the Braddock land, Red Elk's grandson among them. They brought no weapons, just a small gift,
a medicine bag, stitched with the shape of a white horse running. Letty kept it on the mantel above the fire, never moved it, never explained it. That same year, Clay built a new corral, wider, stronger, open to the east. When a young Mustang wandered in from the hills one morning, wild-eyed and dust-covered, they didn't chase it off. They just left the gate open and waited. By then, Letty had learned the difference between force and patience, between broken spirits and free ones, between promises made for show and those kept in silence. Years turned slow, and in time, a boy with sandy hair and wide shoulders learned to throw a rope and whisper to colts. He asked once about the white horse in the painting above the hearth. Clay didn't say much, just gave a small nod and said, "He ran where he was needed most." The boy didn't understand then, but he would, because the land remembers. The wind carries stories older than fences. The ground drinks blood and grows things from it. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a stallion still runs, free and wild, born of fire and thunder, unclaimed by any man. And in a little town with dust on its boots and sun in its bones, they still tell the story of the girl who promised to marry the man who tamed the horse, and the quiet drifter who stepped forward not to claim her, but to set everything free.